We focus so much of our lives on time. Waking up on time, going to work on time, eating at certain times of the day, being punctual for appointments and events. Let's face it, we're totally obsessed with time. In many ways, it basically dictates our lives. And yet, what is time really? Does it actually have any value in and of itself? Or is it simply a construct of the human mind? Now, of course, certain aspects of external reality do offer some pretty convincing evidence. The day-night cycle, the 4 seasons, the aging process, etc. And time appears to have some consistent intrinsic properties, like always moving forward towards the future, never backwards. And so, while the way we choose to measure time, using seconds, minutes, hours, and so forth, may be fairly arbitrary, the existence of time itself seems to be ironclad and undeniable. But I would argue that this is only because we live in a physical reality with space and matter. And more importantly, it's not a stationary universe either. Things are constantly in motion, changing, and evolving. And so the ways in which we measure time are essentially just predictable rhythms of movement, repeated and reliable patterns that we can use to assess how much time has elapsed. Time then, in a sense, is purely conceptual. It can be reduced simply to movement through space. Every conceivable way we have of measuring time relies upon this. Think about it. Whether it's the hands on a clock, the sun's passage across the sky, your heartbeat, if there's no movement, then time loses all meaning because there's no way to track change, and one moment becomes indistinguishable from the next. This is why in movies and TV shows, it's a common trope that whenever they stop time, everything on screen simply freezes in place. We intuitively recognize the fact that stopping all movement is effectively the same thing as stopping time. Even if you want to argue that you can still sense the time passing while sitting perfectly motionless in a room where nothing's moving, you can't shut off your basic bodily functions. Your heart is still beating, blood is pumping, you're breathing in and out. These internal biological rhythms are always present for as long as we're alive. So time and the movement of matter through space look to be inseparable. This is exactly what Einstein discovered through his theory of relativity, and it led him to integrate time and space into a single entity, 4D spacetime. Now, I'm no expert on the subject of theoretical physics, I just happen to have a passing interest when it overlaps with topics like metaphysics, consciousness, and spirituality. And while I may not be smart enough to understand the mathematical formulas that underpin it all, it seems to me that if time is so deeply intertwined with space, such that the most famous physicists in history chose to combine them both together, well, this is a pretty sure sign that time on its own maybe isn't all that useful. We already know, again thanks to Einstein, that time is relative depending on how fast you're moving. We could go one step further and suggest it also depends on one's frequency, with different frequency levels having a pronounced effect on time, or at least our perception of it. Similar to how someone traveling closer to the speed of light would literally age slower than someone moving at our regular Earth speed, time also seems to become distorted when you're vibrating at higher frequencies. What does that mean exactly? We're not talking about shivering or physically vibrating, of course. It's more of an energetic quality of being, a state of resonance. A mundane example can be found in the old adage, time flies when you're having fun. Well, it's true. When you're enjoying yourself, you're typically deeply immersed in whatever you're doing. Maybe that's playing a sport, or reading a book, or just hanging out with friends. Whatever the case, you enter into a state of flow, which is a higher frequency level than, say, feeling bored or frustrated. And so time seems to go by more quickly than if you were watching paint dry or counting the minutes until your work shift ends. A more pronounced version of this time distortion effect can be experienced on psychedelic substances like psilocybin, where a 5 to 6 hour period can easily feel like 10 to 12 hours. It's just so patently obvious that time subjectively seems to pass faster or slower depending on our mental or energetic state. You don't need me to tell you that. We've all had countless experiences of this before. In closing then, time isn't nearly as fundamental as we might normally assume. This is because it is completely dependent on the movement of matter through space. We can't seem to even conceptualize it at all without this. And furthermore, our perception of time ultimately has to do with our frequency level. This is the spiritual counterpart, or extension, if you will, of Einstein's theory of relativity. I would even go so far as to argue that time itself is something of an illusion, given that it only arises as a consequence of a moving physical universe. Remember, if you take away movement through space, time loses all meaning. Please let us know what you think about this in the comments below, and thank you for watching.